Hey guys, you ready for another game walkthrough? So I've played one game today and I'm going to share it with you. And this is a really good example of the importance of never letting up. Do not take your eye off the ball. And when you have an advantage, you have to consolidate, you have to press forward your advantage. Now, that might mean that you get an opportunity to attack, in which case that's fine, you can attack as long as you're defended. But you cannot get complacent, you cannot take your eye off the ball, you cannot get lazy, and you need to avoid making sloppy moves. And this is just a wonderful example of that. So I'm playing here with the white pieces and I play e4 and I get the Sicilian with c5. And I'm playing this Snyder variation at the moment with pawn to b3. And we have d6. So I fianchetto my bishop on b2. My opponent plays knight f6. Obviously that's attacking this pawn on e4. So I push d3 to defend that. I'm not too concerned about my light square bishop right now. I think it can come in maybe on the king side. The idea with this kind of Grand Prix approach that I'm playing, it's a modified Grand Prix approach. Now we have a quiet a6 and I push f4. So this is the Grand Prix setup when you have the pawns on e4 and f4 against the Sicilian. Okay. And now e6, I develop my knight. Knight to c6, and now my bishop moves preparing to castle kingside. So black does something similar and we both castle. Okay, now I'll move my queen across to e1. This is very common in the Grand Prix. The queen's not going to get through on the light square diagonal, so you're going to want to bring your queen out here to take part in an attack. And now black reroutes his knight back around to e8. Slightly unusual, so it's acting as a second or third defender of that pawn. It's acting as a second defender of that pawn, which of course is targeted by my bishop right now. So maybe he's worried about the queen coming out and a checkmate threat on there. I play my queen to g3 anyway, which means that the knight is actually now stuck. It cannot come away from the defense of g7 right now. And now we have a pawn push. So that does break the bishop's path through to g7. However, you have to be conscious that it's also slightly weakening black's king's protection to a degree. So I now reroute my other knight, which was pretty useless at the time. So that might have ideas of coming around. Could even come to here. If we have pawn pushes, it could come in here. But it was doing nothing back on b1. And this also connects my rooks together, which is all good. Now we have the rook moving forward to f7, so that's acting as another defender of this. But my dark squared bishop is menacing there. And that really started from, what, move 3 that I moved my bishop there. Okay, now the knight comes in, also making way for its friend here, so we might be able to use both knights. And at this point, I blunder. Okay, so knight comes in and obviously it's attacking c2. I simply drop my light square bishop back to d1 to defend, and now we have pawn to f5. Now if I was doing the goldfish approach, I would say, well, what has changed about this? And what has changed is that we have two attackers now on that knight in the shape of the bishop and the queen. Okay, how many defenders? Only one. So this knight is under defended and therefore hanging. Now what I did at the time, so I was playing on the tablet in bed and my wife's talking to me about what's going on that day. I thought, oh yeah, my knight's defended, but I might as well kick his knight away. Now this does not work. So I played this move far too quickly, 7 seconds. And my opponent didn't even have to think either, simply grabs the knight here. And what's important is that that capture comes with an attack on the queen. So I can't recapture, because his first capture came with a greater threat than my threat of capturing the knight. So I have to move my queen, and now the knight moves away out of safety. So now black This is actually the first capture of the game. Black is now a full minor piece in front. So what have we said about being in front? You have to consolidate, you have to maintain your advantage and press it home. Right? It's not the time to start freewheeling or coasting or taking life any easier. So now the other knight comes in, so hitting the bishop twice, bishop moves back, and now I capture a pawn in the middle. So at this point, I need to be aggressive, right? I'm a full minor piece down. I cannot afford a war of attrition where my opponent simply, consolidates and then tries to make equal trade-offs, because that would leave me a full minor piece down in the end game, and I'm very, very likely to lose at that point. So what I've got to do now is I've got to take stock, right? Accept, yes, I made a boo-boo. But then I have to say to myself, okay, well, what are my strengths? What are my positional strengths? What are my attacking strengths? I think if we look at the board now, you can see that a lot of Black's pieces are still on the back rank, not really in the game very much. Black has no f-pawn. That might make a difference. I do still have quite an interesting bishop on this diagonal, but it's also now facing off against Black's dark squared bishop. And I've still got my bishop and my other rook to bring into the game. So the pragmatic approach is to say, okay, well, what can I do here and what should I do? Strategically, I need to now take the game to my opponent, right? Because otherwise I'm on a path to a gradual and painful loss. Right, so Black takes the pawn on f5. I now put my other bishop onto a diagonal, also now facing down at Black's king. Very loud cockerel this morning. Maybe I might also have ideas about pushing this pawn, and then I've got two attackers on this pawn here. But I don't want to be trading off at this point in time. Now, knight to b4. Clearly it's attacking my bishop, but it's also moving into a place where it can be captured. Now I need to ask, okay, well, what is the relative value of these pieces? Now, in general, I don't want to be doing exchanges right now because I'm already a piece down. So exchanges will only favour my opponent. However, in this case, I figured that his only really developed piece here, this knight, is much better than my bishop, which currently doesn't have much of a future down that diagonal because Black's got his light square bishop on there. Okay, so I figured opening up the board, then move my bishop, my rook across. Okay, now I've engaged another piece into the attack, and Black's still looking kind of undeveloped. So it's time to strike while the iron is hot. Black throws in a check now. No problem at all. I simply move my king onto a light square where that bishop isn't going to bother it, and the bishop moves again, obviously because it's attacked here by the knight. And so now I move my knight in, attacking the rook. Okay, we have another exchange. Interesting. But it's all opening up this area of the board. And now I've got, okay, queen can now take the pawn. But in actual fact, what Black decides to do here is push the pawn onto g6. Doesn't attempt to defend it. Sorry, doesn't capture my pawn. Now I think about doubling up my rook. So if I can double up my rooks here, take advantage of this open file, I could capture the knight, force the queen to take, rook takes, and that's a winning position. Knight moves away so that it's actually guarding the square that it was on, and we swap off some pawns in the middle. Now, here, Black makes, I think, 3 bad moves in a row. Black is in an undoubtedly winning position based on material alone, but material alone doesn't win games unless you can grind it down into a finish where your material superiority can just dominate the board. Okay, now this was clearly a mistake. So if you look at what I'm doing here, is the reason for this capture is I'm not interested in the pawns on this side of the board. Removing pawns on that side of the board is going to do nothing to help my cause. However, this pawn here was in the way, okay? And it was blocked, right? What I want to do is I want to put my bishop onto this diagonal, right? Pinning the rook onto the king and potentially winning the rook, okay? So the reason why I captured this pawn here is so that I can get rid of this pawn and put my bishop on there, right? Black doesn't notice. He simply grabs a pawn, right? I now push again. What does black do? In 16 seconds, just grabs the pawn and missing, crucially, this threat, okay? Now, we do have bishop to here, and I've got two attackers. We actually have 4 cockerels at the moment, or 5 cockerels. So at the moment they're all outside my front door causing havoc, okay? So yes, we have bishop here or possibly knight here. So there's 2 pieces defending that square, but I also have 2 attackers. So whichever piece were to move here, we've got takes, 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 and I effectively win a piece. So that's not viable. So we have knight instead to d5 where it is protected by the queen. But again, I think that is an error. Because I can now double up my rooks with an attack against black on the back rank. We could have had knight to here, but then there takes, and black's in check again, and I have the opportunity to move my queen to safety. So here again, this is really the final nail for black. Black gets greedy and thinks, I will grab another pawn, right? But it isn't all about material. It's about danger. It's about winning opportunities, right? And so what that does is, grabbing that pawn here actually undefends this knight. The queen was the only defender of that knight, and the knight is under attack, okay? So what black's now done is lost his knight, but not only that, now the bishop can't interpose and stop this pin idea. Right, so in one move, right, black has lost effectively 2 pieces. So I capture the knight, reinstating the pin on the rook, and there's no defender. There's no other piece that can stop this bishop coming in. So we have a simple pawn push, and that comes with an attack. This is a discovered attack on my queen. Now, do I have to move my queen? Well, probably at some point. But I actually have some ideas here. So what I actually played in the game was simply bishop takes f7. Okay. Another idea I think could actually have been rook e8 check, and this rook can't move because it's pinned by the bishop. Okay. So if the king moves, I could then capture this bishop, defended also by my queen. Okay. So that was one idea. In the end, I went for the straightforward approach, and here, interestingly, the king moves instead of capturing the piece. And I'm not clear why the king didn't simply capture the piece. Okay, so right, there's still the attack against my queen, okay? So if my next move doesn't come with check, I'm going to have to do something about that attack. Now, here's the situation on the board. The king is actually attacking my bishop. The bishop is actually attacking my queen. Now I could defend the bishop by moving a rook up or something like that, but then I'd lose my queen, so what's the point in that? Now, what I would like to do is to save both pieces. Okay? I don't know why black didn't capture. And I find the move that saves both pieces. Bishop to e6. That blocks this bishop's attack, so my queen is now no longer under attack, but also it puts a second attacker against this bishop, which is only defended once. So we have an exchange, and I go in with my queen, and now I'm a full rook up at this point. I go in with another check, and queen blocks. Now, critical decision, do you exchange queens? Now, I'm a full rook up, although I'm a couple of pawns behind, so I decide it's probably okay to go ahead and exchange queens at this point, and now I can use the power of my extra rook to hoover up some pawns up here. One pawn moves, I grab the other, This pawn now is really not going to make it all the way to safety, but we have a5 defending the pawn. The pawn simply pushes, breaking the check. I move my rook across, looking at this pawn, and the king moves out, and we have some maneuvering now. We trade a few pawns, I defend that pawn, and now we have a capture and the king retakes. So right now I've actually gathered back, regained both of my pawns. The king is here with guarding these two pawns on this side, but there shouldn't be any problem. However, see how the game develops, because we almost get into a situation where here we could end up with a draw. I think in chess, if you get 50 moves without anything being captured, that becomes a draw. Okay, so yeah, I dropped that last pawn, but now I'm thinking, right, I just need to convert this winning opportunity. But we have a check. I block, looking to exchange rooks, and now this rook just keeps jumping back to this fourth rank. Okay. Now what I'd like to do is maybe get one of my rooks on the fourth rank, push a pawn. If pawn takes, rook takes, something like that. I have to find a way to break through. However, on this side of the board here, my king is actually very, very exposed. So this rook can just keep moving up and down and checking my king, right? You see how it goes. So we have rook in here, move across, rook's guarding the fourth rank, now with check, now I block. Now he goes back to the fourth rank, okay? So my opponent is actually playing very cleverly here. I move my rook down, I'm trying another idea, another check, block it, fourth rank again. Move my rook across to support this pawn, but that's not really good enough, because if takes, yeah, maybe we'd have an exchange. Maybe I should have pushed, but he doesn't let me push. Drops it into h4. Okay, so I move my rook away, trying something else. Move my rooks together. Now I'm pinning this pawn here. So this pawn can't move forwards, but he just checks me. Then I block it, then he goes back to the fourth rank. Okay, and I'm like struggling here. I'm thinking, how can I get through? You know, yeah, I could put both of my rooks on the sixth rank here and go after this pawn, but if I do that, what's going to stop this rook from just moving up and down and checking my king? Okay, now if that does happen, you've always got this idea of zigzagging your king towards the rook until you get right into its face and it can't actually check you. Okay, but then the rook moves across to the other side of the board and you have to zigzag back. And we could have burned through 50 moves potentially doing that. So the rook moves away, still on the fourth rank. I play rook b3, rook stays on the fourth rank. Now I come up, okay, with an attack on this pawn. Check, and I block it. Fourth rank again, okay? Fifth rank, let's try that. Move my rook, check. Move the king away, right? Now the king moves down, and this is the final moment, really, because what's happened here is black blinked first. Okay, this is move 71 of the game. Black blinked. I check, and now I've got the fourth rank. You see the difference, right? Now I can advance this pawn. Maybe I can get both of my rooks onto here. Okay, so now I advance the pawn, and now I capture his pawn, right? He can't, I guess his pawn could have taken there. Capture his pawn, I drop my rook back down to the back rank, and now, you know, it's not going to be too difficult. So what I want to do here is I want to get my king here in this opposition position, and that prevents the king from coming to either of these two squares. Then I can try and use my rooks to force the king. If I put the king in check there because it can't advance, you know, it would have to retreat to one of these squares, which it doesn't want to do because my king would then take the pawn. And my opponent at this point does actually resign. But that was a really key move. This idea, moving the king forward. So black's thinking this is a deadlock. And it was. It was like a deadlock. But this just gave me the fourth rank. And then after that, the position falls apart. So my opponent at that point, when the boot's on the other foot, should be thinking, okay, I am seriously down in material now. Okay, I am in a very potentially lost situation. But when you've got a deadlock like that, the pragmatic thing to do is to, I think, moving the rook back to the fourth rank, we would probably have ended up with a draw. That's the way the game was going. So it's very interesting that my opponent just kind of lost his nerve. Still got 10 minutes on the clock, plenty of time to force that draw. But yeah, I think a very interesting game. So the lesson is very clearly, when you have an advantage, you've got to find a way to press it home, right? Don't dial down your evil when you're up in material. Also, when you're down in material, right? So when I blundered that piece earlier on, that knight I think it was, I didn't compound my error by starting to play too quick. I slowed down, right? Took my time. I thought, what are my strengths in this game? What are the opportunities and advantages that I've got in my favour, right? That could maybe negate the fact that that I'm a piece down. And I think also a key thing is the fact that my opponent didn't develop all of their pieces quickly enough into the game, allowing me some of those like attacking opportunities as well. So there you go. Hope this has been useful for you. Please leave a comment, let me know what you think, and also subscribe to Chess Boot Camp if you haven't subscribed yet, and see if I can help you in any way to improve your chess, help you to win more and enjoy the game even more. So thank you for watching, and I'll see you soon.